$2. Corbin Ashworth's calloused hand shot up like lightning, his voice cutting through the autumn air of Willowbrook's town square. The crowd turned to stare at the towering lumberjack whose flannel shirt strained against his broad shoulders. Behind him, his axe gleamed against the oak tree where he'd been sharpening it moments before the commotion began. The woman on the makeshift platform stood motionless, a coarse burlap sack covering her head completely, tied with rough rope around her neck. Her hands were bound behind her back, and her simple brown dress hung loose on her frame. The auctioneer, a weaselly man named Mortimer Griggs, had been calling for bids on damaged goods for the past 10 minutes, starting at $5 and working his way down. "Going once for $2 to the lumberjack," Griggs called out, his gold tooth glinting in the afternoon sun. "Anyone else willing to take this burden off Mayor Holcomb's hands?" The crowd murmured among themselves. Old Widow Pennyworth clutched her shawl tighter and whispered to her neighbor about the scandal of it all. 3 men in worn overalls spat tobacco juice and shook their heads. Even the town drunk, Jasper Mudwell, looked away in disgust. Corbin had been watching from beneath the old oak, taking a break from splitting logs for the Henderson family's winter supply. He'd heard the rumors about the mysterious woman who'd arrived on the morning stage 3 days ago. She'd caused quite a stir when she'd stumbled off the coach, disoriented and speaking in what sounded like gibberish. Dr. Whitmore had examined her and declared her touched in the head after she'd scratched and bitten anyone who tried to remove the sack from her head. Mayor Holcomb had decided she was a vagrant and a public nuisance. The town council voted to auction her off to the highest bidder, who would be responsible for her care and conduct. It was an old law, rarely enforced, but legal nonetheless in the year 1847. Going twice. Griggs raised his gavel, scanning the crowd one final time. Something stirred in Corbin's chest as he watched her slight frame trembling on the platform. Maybe it was the way she held her head high despite her circumstances, or perhaps it was the memory of his own mother, who'd died, alone and forgotten in a charity house back in Pennsylvania. He'd sworn then that he'd never let another soul suffer such abandonment if he could prevent it. Sold to Corbin Ashworth for $2. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The crowd dispersed quickly, uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed. Corbin strode forward, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden platform. He pulled out 2 crumpled dollar bills and handed them to Griggs, who snatched the money eagerly. "She's all yours, lumberjack," Griggs sneered. "Good luck with that one." "Been nothing but trouble since she arrived." Corbin ignored him and approached the woman carefully. She'd gone rigid at his approach, her head turning slightly as if tracking his movement despite the sack covering her face. "Ma'am," he said gently, his deep voice barely above a whisper, "I'm going to untie your hands now. I won't hurt you." She flinched when his fingers touched the rope, but she didn't fight him. As the bindings fell away, she brought her hands around front and rubbed her wrists. Corbin noticed her fingers were long and elegant, despite the dirt under her nails. "Can you walk?" Corbin asked, extending his arm toward her but not quite touching. The woman nodded once, a jerky movement that made the sack rustle. "My cabin's about a mile through the woods. It's not much, but it's warm and clean." She remained silent as they left the town square behind, following him down a narrow dirt path that wound between towering pines and maples ablaze with fall colors. Corbin shortened his usual long strides to match her smaller steps, stealing glances at her as they walked. Despite the sack and her disheveled state, there was something graceful about the way she moved, like a dancer trying not to stumble. The cabin came into view as they crested a small hill. It was a modest structure Corbin had built himself from local timber, with a stone chimney sending lazy smoke into the crisp air. A small vegetable garden, now mostly harvested, stretched along the south side, and split logs were stacked neatly under the covered porch. "This is home," he said simply, opening the wooden door and gesturing for her to enter first. She hesitated at the threshold, her head tilting as if listening for something. Then she stepped inside, and Corbin noticed she moved with surprising confidence for someone who couldn't see. The interior was sparse but comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with 2 handmade chairs positioned nearby. A simple Wooden table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs. The kitchen area occupied the far corner, with shelves lined with preserves and dried goods. A ladder led to a small loft where Corbin kept his bed and few personal belongings. "Are you hungry?" he asked, moving to the stove where a pot of venison stew had been simmering. She nodded again, that same careful movement. Corbin ladled the stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table. "Ma'am, I'm going to cut the rope around your neck now so you can eat. But I won't remove the sack unless you want me to." Her hands flew to her throat, clutching at the rope. She shook her head violently, backing away from him until she hit the wall. "Easy, easy," Corbin said, raising both hands peacefully. "I won't do anything you don't want, but you need to eat, and that rope's got to be uncomfortable." After a long moment, she nodded and pointed to herself, then made a cutting motion with her finger. She wanted to do it herself. Corbin handed her his pocket knife, handle first. She took it with steady hands and carefully sawed through the rope. When it fell away, she rubbed her neck gingerly, but kept the sack firmly in place. They sat across from each other at the table, and Corbin watched in fascination as she lifted the bottom of the sack just enough to reveal her mouth and chin. Her skin was pale but smooth, and her lips were full and naturally pink. She ate delicately, like someone who'd been taught proper manners, which struck Corbin as odd given her circumstances. "My name's Corbin," he said after they'd eaten in silence for several minutes. "Corbin Ashworth. Been living in these parts for about 3 years now." She set down her spoon and went very still. Then, in a voice like honey over gravel, she spoke her first words. "Cordelia," she said. "My name is Cordelia Ravencrest." The name hit Corbin like a physical blow. Ravencrest. He'd heard that name before, whispered in taverns and spoken in hushed tones around campfires. The Ravencrest family had been one of the wealthiest in Virginia, with vast plantations and political influence that stretched all the way to Washington. But there had been a scandal several years back, something about murder and madness that had destroyed the family completely. "Ravencrest," he repeated slowly. "As in, the Virginia Ravencrests?" Cordelia's hands began to shake and she pushed her bowl away. "You know the name," she whispered, her voice carrying years of pain. "Then you know what I am." Corbin leaned back in his chair, studying her hidden face. "I know the stories, but I don't know you." She laughed bitterly, a sound that seemed to echo from some deep, hollow place inside her. "The stories are all true, every horrible, twisted word of them." The firelight flickered across the room as Cordelia began to speak, her voice growing stronger with each word. She told him about growing up as the youngest daughter of Reginald Ravencrest, about the grand estate called Blackmore that had been in the family for generations. She spoke of her father's drinking, her mother's laudanum, addiction, and her 3 older brothers who'd inherited the family's cruelty along with its wealth. "I was different," she continued, her fingers worrying the edge of the burlap sack. "I could see things, sense things that others couldn't. Mother said I was cursed, that I'd brought shame on the family name. Father wanted to send me away to an asylum, but grandfather intervened. He was the only one who understood." Corbin poured himself another cup of coffee, the strong brew helping him process what she was telling him. "What kind of things could you see?" "Death," she said simply. "I could feel it coming sometimes days in advance. I could see the darkness that lived in people's hearts, the evil they tried to hide. My family thought it made me mad, but grandfather knew better. He said it was a gift, even if it felt like a curse." She told him about the night everything changed. Her eldest brother Nathaniel had been gambling heavily and had lost the family fortune to a riverboat captain named Blackjack Morrison. In desperation, Nathaniel had tried to murder Morrison in his sleep, but Cordelia had seen it in a vision and warned the man. Morrison had survived, but barely. "Nathaniel blamed me for his failure," Cordelia continued. "He convinced Father that I was dangerous, that my visions were actually me conspiring with their enemies. They held a family tribunal and declared me insane. The night before she was to be committed to the state asylum, Cordelia had overheard her brothers planning to kill her instead. They'd decided it would be easier to claim she'd died of her madness rather than risk her escaping from the institution and exposing their crimes. "So I ran," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I took nothing but the clothes on my back and ran into the night. But they followed me. They chased me for 3 days through the countryside, hunting me like an animal." She'd managed to reach the town of Millerville, where she'd begged passage on a westbound stage. But the conductor had recognized her name from wanted posters her family had put up, claiming she was a dangerous escaped lunatic who'd murdered her grandfather. "That wasn't true," Cordelia said fiercely. "Grandfather died of his weak heart, but they used his death to paint me as a killer. The stage driver threatened to turn me over to the authorities, so I put this sack over my head and told them I had a terrible disfigurement. I thought if they couldn't see my face, they wouldn't recognize me." Corbin set down his cup with a soft clink. "And that's how you ended up here. The stage driver dumped me in Willowbrook 3 days ago. I was so tired, so frightened that I could barely think straight. When people tried to help me, I fought them because I didn't know if they'd seen the wanted posters. I must have seemed truly mad." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Corbin stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening forest. "Why are you telling me all this? You could have kept your secrets." "Because you spoke my name," Cordelia said softly. "When I told you who I was, you didn't run. You didn't call me mad or dangerous. You just listened." 3 weeks passed like a gentle dream. Cordelia kept the sack over her head during the daylight hours, but as the evenings grew longer, she would lift it just enough to eat or drink tea by the firelight. Corbin respected her need for concealment, never pressing her to reveal more than she was comfortable showing. During the days while Corbin worked his lumber contracts, Cordelia transformed his simple cabin into something approaching a home. She mended his torn clothing with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She organized his chaotic collection of tools and supplies. Most surprisingly, she began cooking meals that surpassed anything Corbin had ever tasted, despite the limitations of working half-blind. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked one evening as they shared a rabbit stew seasoned with herbs she'd somehow identified in his neglected garden. "Our cook at Blackmore was a Frenchwoman named Madeline," Cordelia replied, her voice growing warm with the memory. "She taught me when Mother wasn't watching, said a lady should know how to care for herself, even if she never had to." In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. Cordelia told him stories of her childhood, the happy moments before her family's darkness consumed everything. Corbin shared tales of his own past, growing up poor in Pennsylvania, losing his parents to cholera, and making his way west in search of something he couldn't quite name. "What were you looking for?" Cordelia asked one night as rain drummed against the windows. Corbin considered the question carefully. "Peace, I suppose. A place where a man's worth isn't measured by his family name or his connections, but by the work of his hands and the honesty of his heart. Have you found it?" He looked across the firelit space at her shrouded figure, noting the way she held, her teacup with unconscious elegance, the graceful curve of her neck visible below the sack's rough edge. "I'm beginning to think I have." As October deepened into November, their conversations grew more intimate. Cordelia began to trust him with her visions, describing the strange dreams and intuitions that had plagued her since childhood. She told him about sensing his approach long before he spoke at the auction, about the unusual warmth she'd felt when he'd untied her hands. "I've never felt safe with anyone," she admitted one particularly cold night. "But with you, it's like the darkness. In my mind grows quiet." Corbin had moved his chair closer to hers, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her hand if he dared. "Maybe that's because there is no darkness in me for you to sense. Everyone has darkness, Corbin. It's the nature of humanity." "Then, maybe I'm just simple enough that my darkness doesn't run very deep," she laughed, a sound that had grown lighter over the weeks. "You're not simple. You're the most genuinely good man I've ever known." The first snow fell on a Tuesday morning. In late November, Corbin woke to find Cordelia standing at the kitchen window, the sack pushed back just far enough that he could see her profile in silhouette. She had a delicate nose and high cheekbones, and her hair, what he could see of it, appeared to be a rich auburn color. "It's beautiful," she said softly, watching the fat flakes drift past the glass. "I haven't seen snow in 3 years." "Seen?" Corbin asked gently. "I thought you kept your eyes covered." She tensed, realizing her slip. Sometimes I lift the sack when I'm alone, when I'm certain no one can see me." "Cordelia," he said, moving closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. "What are you hiding from?" For a long moment she didn't answer. Then slowly she turned to face him, though the sack still obscured her features. "My face," she whispered. "The night I ran from Blackmore, Nathaniel caught up with me at a river crossing. He had a knife, and when I fought him—" She touched the sack gently. "He marked me, Corbin. He cut me so that even if I escaped, I would bear his hatred forever." "Show me," Corbin said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage that flared in his chest at the thought of someone harming her. Cordelia stepped back, shaking her head. "No, you've been kind to me, kinder than anyone has ever been. I won't repay that kindness by horrifying you with my disfigurement." "You could never horrify me. You don't understand. It's not just a simple scar, Nathaniel." She paused, her voice catching. He was very thorough in his cruelty. Corbin moved closer, stopping just arm's length away. "Cordelia, look at my hands." Confused, she tilted her head toward him. He held up his hands, palms toward her. "These hands have scars from every axe blade that's ever slipped, every saw that's bitten back, every splinter that's gone too deep to dig out clean. My back has whip marks from the overseer at the logging camp where I worked before coming here. My left shoulder has a bullet scar from a claim jumper who thought my timber rights looked better than his own." He lowered his hands slowly. "We all carry marks from the battles we've fought to survive. Yours might be on your face, but they don't define who you are any more than mine define me." Tears had begun to seep through the burlap, darkening the coarse fabric. "It's not the same, Corbin. A man can wear his scars with pride. A woman can wear hers with courage," he finished. "Which is exactly what you've been doing." They stood in silence for several heartbeats, snow continuing to fall outside the window like a blessing. Finally, Cordelia reached up with trembling hands and began to untie the sack. "If you turn away," she whispered, "I'll understand. But please, don't lie and tell me it doesn't matter." The sack fell to the floor with a soft whisper. Corbin's breath caught, but not for the reason Cordelia expected. Yes, there was a scar, a thin white line that ran from her left temple down to her jaw, and another that crossed her right cheek like a lightning bolt. But her beauty was so striking, so luminous, that the scars seemed almost insignificant by comparison. Her eyes were the color of emeralds in candlelight, framed by thick auburn lashes. Her hair, freed from its confines, cascaded over her shoulders in waves that caught the morning light like burnished copper. Her skin, pale from months of concealment, had the translucent quality of fine porcelain. "My God," he breathed. "You're beautiful?" Cordelia's eyes widened in shock. "Beautiful? Corbin, are you blind? Look at me." "I am looking at you," he said, taking a step closer, "and I'm seeing the most beautiful woman I've ever laid eyes on. But the scars are proof that you're a survivor. They're proof that you fought back against someone who tried to destroy you, and you won." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently traced the scar on her left cheek with his fingertip. "They're part of your story, Cordelia, but they're not the whole story." She leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun, tears streaming down her face. "I've been so afraid," she whispered. "So ashamed." "You have nothing to be ashamed of." His voice was firm, carrying absolute conviction. "Nothing at all." For the first time since they'd met, Cordelia smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. The scars didn't disappear, but they seemed to fade, in importance next to the radiance of her joy. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Then she gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" Corbin silenced her with a kiss, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said. "I think I have since that first day at the auction, when you held your head high despite everything they were putting you through. Marry me," Cordelia said, her voice strong and sure. "Not because you bought me, not because you feel sorry for me, but because we choose each other." "Yes," Corbin replied without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The wedding took place on a crisp December morning, with fresh snow covering the ground like lace. Pastor Clements from the Willowbrook Church had initially balked at the idea of marrying the mad woman from the auction, but Corbin's quiet determination and Cordelia's obvious intelligence had eventually won him over. The ceremony was simple, held in Corbin's cabin with only a handful of witnesses. Doc Whitmore attended, shamefaced about his earlier diagnosis but curious enough about Cordelia's transformation to want to see her happiness for himself. Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, the town's schoolmarm, came at Cordelia's shy request, bringing a small bouquet of winterberries and pine boughs. Even Jasper Mudwell cleaned himself up for the occasion, having been surprisingly moved by the story of two outcasts finding love. Cordelia wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Holloway had helped her alter from one of Corbin's mother's belongings. He'd kept in a trunk. Her scars were clearly visible in the morning light, but her joy was so radiant that they seemed merely part of her unique beauty. "Do you, Corbin Ashworth, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Pastor Clements asked, his voice carrying more warmth than anyone had expected. "I do," Corbin replied, his deep voice steady and sure. "And do you, Cordelia Ravencrest, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she said, her green eyes sparkling with unshed tears of happiness. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Oregon, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Corbin cupped Cordelia's scarred face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her as snow began to fall outside the windows, blessing their union with nature's own confetti. The small gathering celebrated with a meal that Cordelia and Mrs. Holloway had prepared together: roasted venison, fresh bread, preserved vegetables, and a wedding cake made with wild honey and dried berries. Doc Whitmore produced a bottle of real champagne he'd been saving for a special occasion, and even Pastor Clements allowed himself a small glass. As the afternoon wore on, and their guests prepared to leave, Cordelia pulled Corbin aside. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her expression serious. "Something I saw in a vision last night." Corbin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What is it?" "My brothers," she said quietly. "They're coming. Nathaniel and Marcus are on their way here, probably no more than a week behind. They finally tracked me down." The color drained from Corbin's face. "How can you be sure? The same way I knew about Black Jack Morrison, the same way I knew you were a good man when you bought me at that auction. The visions don't lie, Corbin. They never have." Doc Whitmore, overhearing part of their conversation, approached with concern. "Is everything all right?" Cordelia looked at Corbin, silently asking for permission. When he nodded, she explained about the Ravencrest brothers and the danger they represented. "We could leave," Corbin said immediately. "Pack up tonight and head north to Washington Territory. Start fresh where they'll never find us." But Cordelia shook her head. "Running won't solve anything. They'll just keep hunting me, and I refuse to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder." Her voice grew stronger, more determined. "Besides, I'm not the same frightened girl who fled Blackmore. I have something worth fighting for now." Doc Whitmore cleared his throat. "If I may suggest, perhaps we should inform Sheriff Dugan about this potential threat. And if these men are as dangerous as you say, the town might want to prepare." "No," Cordelia said firmly. "This is my fight, and I won't ask the people of Willowbrook to risk themselves for me." They've already given me more kindness than I ever expected. Corbin took her hands in his. Then we faced them together, but we faced them smart. The Ravencrest brothers arrived on a gray January morning, their expensive horses and tailored traveling clothes marking them as outsiders the moment they rode down Willowbrook's main street. Nathaniel Ravencrest was a tall, sharp-faced man with cold blue eyes and perfectly groomed dark hair. His younger brother Marcus was stockier but no less dangerous, with the same cruel mouth and calculating gaze. They went directly to the sheriff's office, presenting official-looking documents claiming that Cordelia was an escaped lunatic who had murdered their grandfather and fled justice. Sheriff Dugan, a decent man but one easily intimidated by wealth and authority, had little choice but to listen to their demands. But Corbin and Cordelia had not been idle during the week of waiting. Word of their situation had spread through the small community and the people of Willowbrook, who had initially been suspicious of the strange woman with the sack over her head, had come to see her transformation into a loving wife and valued neighbor. Mrs. Holloway had organized the women of the town to provide character witnesses. Doc Whitmore had prepared a detailed medical report, attesting to Cordelia's complete sanity. Pastor Clements had written a letter vouching for her moral character. Even Jasper Mudwell, sober for once, had convinced several of his drinking companions to testify on her behalf. More importantly, Corbin had sent word to an old friend from his Pennsylvania days, a man named Judge William Porter, who owed Corbin a significant debt. Porter had arrived in Willowbrook 2 days before the Ravencrest brothers, armed with federal warrants and a thorough knowledge of Virginia law. When Nathaniel and Marcus finally confronted Cordelia outside the general store, they found her surrounded by half the town, including Judge Porter and Sheriff Dugan. "Cordelia," Nathaniel said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Thank God we've found you at last. We've been so worried about your condition." "My condition is excellent, thank you," Cordelia replied calmly, standing beside Corbin with her head held high. "I'm perfectly sane, happily married, and under the protection of federal law." Marcus stepped forward aggressively. "You're coming back to Virginia to face justice for grandfather's murder." "Actually," Judge Porter interrupted, producing an official document, "Mrs. Ashworth is under federal protection as a witness in a case involving fraud and attempted murder in Virginia. It seems there have been some very interesting developments regarding the Ravencrest family finances, and certain questionable deaths." Nathaniel's face went white. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Blackjack Morrison's testimony regarding your attempt to murder him and the subsequent investigation into your family's business practices. It seems Cordelia wasn't the only one you tried to silence." Porter smiled coldly. "Morrison survived, gentlemen, and he's been very cooperative with federal authorities." The crowd murmured with interest as Porter continued. "We also have testimony from several former servants at Blackmore Estate regarding the true circumstances of your grandfather's death and the systematic abuse of your sister." Cordelia stepped forward, her voice carrying across the town square with clarity and strength. "Nathaniel Ravencrest, you tried to kill me because I wouldn't let you murder an innocent man. You scarred my face and destroyed my reputation to cover your own crimes, but you failed. I survived, I found love, and I've built a new life." She gestured to the people surrounding her. "These good people saw past the lies you spread about me. They saw who I really am, not the monster you tried to create." Nathaniel's composure finally cracked. "You little witch. You've always been nothing but trouble for this family." He lunged toward Cordelia, but Corbin was faster. The lumberjack's massive fist connected with Nathaniel's jaw, sending him sprawling in the snow. "That's for what you did to my wife," Corbin said quietly. Sheriff Dugan stepped forward with handcuffs. "Nathaniel and Marcus Ravencrest, you're under arrest on federal charges of fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy." As the brothers were led away, Nathaniel turned back with rage blazing in his eyes. "This isn't over, Cordelia. The Ravencrest name means something." "You're right," Cordelia called after him. "It means cruelty, greed, and cowardice, but I'm not a Ravencrest anymore." I'm Cordelia Ashworth, and that name means love, honesty, and courage. The crowd erupted in cheers as Corbin swept his wife into his arms and spun her around. When he set her down, she was laughing and crying at the same time. "It's really over?" she asked. "It's really over," he confirmed. "You're free, Cordelia. We both are." Judge Porter approached them with a smile. "The federal case should take care of your brothers permanently. But there's one more thing. It seems the Ravencrest estate has been seized to pay their debts, but there are certain personal items that belong to your grandfather, things he specifically left to you in his will." Cordelia wiped her tears and looked up at her husband. "I don't need anything from that old life." "Actually," Porter continued, "one of those items is a deed to some property in California, Gold Country. Your grandfather bought it as an investment, just before he died." Corbin and Cordelia looked at each other, then burst out laughing. "What do you say, Mrs. Ashworth?" Corbin asked. "Ready for another adventure?" "As long as we're together," she replied, reaching up to touch the scars on her face without shame. "I'm ready for anything." They were married at the auction for $2, but they'd found something worth far more than gold. They'd found each other, and they'd found the courage to face whatever the future might bring.